The morning sun shone brightly over the small suburban town as the annual Veterans Parade began. The streets were lined with flags, red, white, and blue banners fluttering in the gentle breeze. Families gathered along the sidewalks, some with small children perched on their parents' shoulders, others chatting excitedly as they waited for the parade to begin. The air was filled with the sounds of marching bands tuning their instruments and the distant rumble of veteran groups preparing for their march down the street. It was a time of celebration and reflection, honoring the sacrifices of those who had served the country, and for many in the neighborhood, it was a highlight of the year. Sarah, now 18, sat at the edge of the crowd, her wheelchair tucked close to the curb so she could have a good view of the parade route. Despite the physical limitations her cerebral palsy imposed on her, Sarah had always loved the energy of the parade. The excitement in the air, the colors, the sounds, it made her feel a part of something bigger than herself. Today was no different. Her face lit up with a bright smile as the veterans marched by, proudly waving flags and nodding in acknowledgement of the crowd's cheers. Her mother, Maria, stood beside her, watching Sarah with a mixture of pride and concern. She had always been there, supporting Sarah in every way she could. The parade meant something special to the both of them, a chance to celebrate the strength and resilience of the country's veterans, but also to honor Sarah's own resilience in the face of adversity. But as the crowd's energy built, so did the tension that had been simmering in the background. Karen, the HOA president, was not far behind, standing across the street with a small group of neighbors. Her sharp, judgmental gaze scanned the crowd, her eyes lingering on Sarah and her family. Karen had never been one to shy away from voicing her opinion about the disruption she believed Sarah's condition caused in the otherwise picture-perfect neighborhood. Sarah's wheelchair, in Karen's eyes, was just one more imperfection in an already imperfect world. Sarah could feel it, even though she couldn't see it. The sharpness of Karen's gaze, the discomfort in the air whenever she was around, it was a constant reminder that not everyone viewed her as worthy of being a part of the community. Yet today, Sarah chose not to let Karen's presence ruin the excitement of the day. She focused on the veterans, the flag bearers, and the honor they carried with each step. But as the parade began to pick up speed, so did the noise. The crowd roared with applause, the drums echoed loudly, and the cheers became deafening. It was easy to get swept up in the excitement, but for Sarah, it was a challenge. The cacophony of sounds, the rush of energy, it all became overwhelming. Her hands clenched the wheels of her chair, and her body tensed, a wave of discomfort beginning to settle over her. Maria noticed Sarah's subtle shift in posture, her daughter's discomfort becoming more apparent. She gently placed her hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, concern flickering in her eyes. "I'm fine, Mom," Sarah replied, forcing a smile despite the growing tension in her body. "Just a little noisy. But I'm good." As the parade continued down the street, Karen's disapproval seemed to grow. Every loud cheer, every burst of applause sent a jolt through her, as if the noise was too much to bear. She didn't like the disorder, the chaos. And as the crowd surged forward, moving to the beat of the parade, Sarah's struggle to stay in the moment became more visible. Karen stood across the street, arms crossed, her face impassive but stern. Her eyes flicked from the rowdy crowd to Sarah, and the unease in her gaze deepened. It wasn't just the noise that bothered her, it was the presence of someone like Sarah, in the middle of the celebration, a reminder that not everyone fit the ideal image of this neighborhood. With every cheer, with every wave of the flag, Karen's disapproval simmered more. This parade, meant to honor sacrifice and courage, had become the perfect backdrop for the tension that had been quietly building between her and the family. As the parade marched on, Sarah and Maria remained in the crowd, but the stage was set for what would come next. The energy of the parade contrasted sharply with the anxiety beginning to build within Sarah. It was a celebration, yes, but for Sarah and Maria, the loud cheers, the vibrant displays of patriotism, and the judgment in Karen's eyes were starting to feel more like a battleground. They were just trying to enjoy the moment, while Karen was looking for a reason to tear it all down. As the parade kicked off, the streets were alive with energy. Veterans, proud in their uniforms, marched down the avenue, each step purposeful and filled with history. The crowd erupted into applause as they passed, the clapping and cheers filling the air. Music blared from loudspeakers, the sounds of patriotic anthems mixing with the rhythmic beat of marching drums. Flags waved proudly in the hands of the onlookers, their red, white, and blue fabric fluttering in time with the excitement. The entire neighborhood seemed to come alive, caught up in the celebration of those who had fought for the country's freedom. For Sarah, the energy of the parade was both exhilarating and overwhelming. She had always loved the feeling of the parade, the bright colors, the sense of unity, but today, something felt different. The noise felt louder, the crowd denser. Her wheelchair moved slowly through the streets, the people pushing and jostling as they made their way toward the front to get a better view. With every step, Sarah could feel her body tensing, her muscles stiffening from the sensory overload. The loud cheers, the clattering of instruments, the booming music, it was all a bit too much. She tried to push through, to enjoy the parade like everyone else, but the overwhelming sounds began to feel like too much. She could feel the weight of the noise pressing down on her, making it harder to focus on anything but the discomfort growing inside her. The world around her seemed to blur, the voices becoming a distant echo. Her hands tightened around the wheelchair's armrests as she tried to maintain control, but her body stiffened, a constant reminder of the disability she had lived with her entire life. "Are you all right, honey?" Maria's voice broke through the chaos, a touch of concern in her tone. She had been watching Sarah closely, sensing the shift in her daughter's demeanor. Sarah nodded, though the smile she offered was strained. "I'm fine, Mom," she said, trying to convince herself as much as her mother. "Just a little, much." Maria's gaze lingered on Sarah, concern evident in her eyes. She knew the parade was something Sarah looked forward to every year, but the combination of the loud sounds and the crowded streets was taking its toll. Still, Maria didn't want to ruin the moment for her daughter. She squeezed Sarah's shoulder gently, silently promising that they would leave if it got too overwhelming. Meanwhile, across the street, Karen was watching the scene unfold. She had stood at the edge of the crowd, arms folded, her face etched with irritation. The parade, for all its joy and pride, had never been her thing. It was too noisy, too chaotic. She preferred quiet, controlled environments, and the boisterousness of the parade unsettled her. But what bothered her even more was Sarah. Karen's eyes scanned the crowd, but it was Sarah who caught her attention. There was something about Sarah's presence, something that grated on Karen's nerves. The wheelchair, the medication she'd seen earlier, it all felt like a disruption in the perfect image of the community that Karen had worked so hard to maintain. Karen's gaze narrowed as she watched Sarah struggling to navigate the crowd, her body stiffening from the noise and movement around her. There was a flicker of something in Karen's expression, something that went beyond discomfort. It was frustration, perhaps even resentment. She couldn't quite understand why the family felt the need to attend these events, why they couldn't just stay at home where they belonged, away from the chaos and the noise. The sight of Sarah's struggle only fueled her irritation. As the parade continued, Karen's behavior grew more erratic. She fidgeted in place, arms crossing tighter over her chest, her jaw clenching in frustration. She could see Sarah now trying to push through the crowd, but every jostle, every loud cheer, seemed to make it worse. Karen's eyes followed Sarah's every move, her frustration growing with each step the girl took. It was as though she could feel Sarah's struggle, and it irked her. In the midst of the parade, Karen began to mutter to herself. "Why do they even have to be here?" she whispered under her breath. "This is a day for veterans, not for distractions." Her words were harsh, but they were barely audible over the noise of the crowd. She shook her head in disdain, feeling the weight of the situation begin to build within her. Sarah's presence, her disability, it all felt like a disruption she couldn't ignore. And as the parade continued, the weight of that discomfort began to settle deeper in her chest. The tension in the air grew thicker as the parade reached its peak. The veterans marched proudly, the crowd roaring with applause. The loudspeakers boomed with music, the drums pounding in rhythm with the excitement of the crowd. For Sarah, it felt like the world was spinning around her. She could barely hear her own thoughts over the cacophony of noise, her body growing tense as the sensory overload became too much to bear. Her eyes flicked to her mother, who was watching her closely, the concern in her expression obvious. Sarah tried to smile again, but it was a hollow gesture, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. Karen, standing across the street, could see it all. The confusion on Sarah's face, the tension in her body, the discomfort radiating from her. It was almost as if the chaos of the parade was too much for Sarah to handle. And Karen? She was done. The noise, the disruption, it was all too much. But instead of understanding, Karen only felt more irritation, her frustration bubbling to the surface as she continued to watch Sarah struggle. The crowd cheered louder, the parade's energy at its peak, but for Sarah, it felt like everything was spiraling out of control. The noise. The chaos. The crowd. It was all too much. And Karen, standing in the distance, couldn't tear her eyes away, each moment of Sarah's discomfort feeding the frustration that had built inside her since the moment the parade had started. The parade had reached its climax, the veterans marching proudly down the street, their chests adorned with medals and ribbons, their faces filled with pride. The crowd had erupted into thunderous applause, waving flags and shouting their appreciation. The sounds of drums and brass instruments reverberated through the streets, a powerful anthem to the courage and sacrifice of the men and women who had served their country. The energy was infectious, the spirit of celebration palpable in the air. But amid the sea of cheering faces, something was brewing. The noise was becoming overwhelming, the vibrations of the loudspeakers pulsing through the crowd. The cheering only grew louder, the applause crescendoing as each veteran marched by. It was a joyous moment, but for some, it felt like too much. For Sarah, it was starting to feel like the walls were closing in. Her body, already on edge from the sensory overload, grew increasingly tense. The noise, the music, the clattering of instruments, it all melded into a cacophony that made it hard to focus, hard to breathe. Sarah's hands gripped the wheels of her wheelchair tightly, her knuckles white. Her heart raced as her muscles began to seize up, the familiar pain creeping through her body. Maria, noticing her daughter's discomfort, placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, trying to offer comfort through the chaos. "Are you okay?" Maria asked, her voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. Sarah nodded, though the tension in her face betrayed her words. "It's just a lot. But I'll be fine." But Maria could see it, the strain in Sarah's eyes, the way her body was rigid with discomfort. She wanted to take Sarah away from the crowd, get her out of the noise, but they had already fought so hard to be here, to be a part of this moment. They wouldn't leave now. Across the street, Karen was watching the scene unfold, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The veterans, the loud music, the jubilant crowd, everything about this moment made her uncomfortable. The energy was too much. She had always preferred order, quiet, and control, and the parade, in all its chaos, represented everything she loathed. The sight of Sarah, sitting in her wheelchair in the middle of it all, made Karen's blood boil. There was something about the way Sarah was so visible, so unapologetically present, that grated on her nerves. Karen's eyes narrowed as she watched Sarah, her discomfort growing with every passing moment. The noise from the crowd, the drumming, the shouting, was unbearable. It felt like it was closing in on her. She could hear the distant murmurs of people around her, but all she could focus on was the overwhelming sensation of panic building in her chest. Her breathing grew shallow as the sound intensified, each cheer, each clap, a piercing jolt in her already frayed nerves. Then, without thinking, Karen did something impulsive. She reached into her bag, her fingers trembling, and pulled out a small handgun. The metallic weight of the gun felt comforting in her hands, a sense of control in a situation that was slipping away from her. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She hadn't planned to use it, but the noise, the chaos, it was too much. She needed to regain control. In a sudden, desperate moment of panic, Karen raised the gun and fired. The sharp crack of the gunshot cut through the celebration, an instant jolt of sound that shattered the festive atmosphere. The crowd's jubilant cheers turned into gasps and screams as the shot echoed in the street. The moment hung in the air, suspended in disbelief. Sarah's body jerked in her chair as the bullet grazed her side, the searing pain making her gasp for air. She barely had time to process what had happened before everything around her descended into chaos. The world seemed to spin as the loud ringing in her ears overtook the sounds of the crowd. Maria, her heart pounding in her chest, turned to see her daughter's face twisted in shock and pain. "Sarah!" Maria screamed, her voice breaking as she rushed toward her daughter, pushing through the panic-stricken crowd. People were screaming. Some were running away, while others rushed to help, their faces a mix of confusion and terror. The music stopped abruptly, the parade now reduced to a blur of frantic movement. The once celebratory atmosphere had turned into a scene of horror, the vibrant flags now lost in the chaos. Maria reached Sarah's side, her heart sinking as she saw the blood staining Sarah's clothes. "Oh my God, Sarah," Maria gasped, her voice barely a whisper as she knelt beside her daughter, her hands trembling as she checked for the wound. Sarah's breath was shallow, her face pale with pain, but she managed to look at her mother. "Mom, I'm okay," she whispered, though the words barely made it past her lips. The pain was intense, but it was the shock of the moment that left her feeling paralyzed. As Maria tried to comfort Sarah, Karen, standing a few feet away, was in a state of shock. The gun, still in her hand, felt strangely heavy now. She was too stunned to move, her mind racing as she tried to comprehend what had just happened. The crowd around her was now pointing, accusing, their eyes wide with fear. She wanted to explain, to justify herself. I didn't mean to. It was the noise. The crowd, it was too much." Karen's voice was shaky, her words spilling out in a panicked rush. "I thought I was in danger. I thought I was being attacked. But the crowd wasn't listening. The confusion and fear were too overwhelming. Someone shouted for an ambulance, others began dialing their phones, and within moments, sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder. Maria's focus was solely on Sarah now, trying to keep her calm as she held her daughter's trembling hands. "You're going to be okay, Sarah. Help is on the way, okay? Just breathe. Stay with me." The chaos continued around them, but for Maria and Sarah, the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. As the sirens grew closer, Maria knew that nothing would ever be the same. The festive day, meant to honor veterans, had been irrevocably changed. And in the midst of it all, one question lingered: why? Why had Karen done this? Why had she taken it this far? The sirens screamed in the distance as the crowd began to scatter, panic lingering in the air like a thick fog. People who had been celebrating moments ago were now huddled in small groups, whispering in hushed tones. The celebratory atmosphere had vanished, replaced by confusion, fear, and disbelief. For Sarah's family, the world seemed to slow down as the events unfolded. Maria's heart raced, her eyes frantically scanning for help, but all she could see was Sarah's pale, trembling face, the blood staining her clothes, a stark reminder of the horror they were now living through. The parade that was meant to honor veterans had been tainted in the most unimaginable way. Her daughter, the one person she had sworn to protect, had been shot by a neighbor, someone they thought they could trust. And yet, as Maria held Sarah's hand, trying to keep her calm, there was one presence that stood out amidst the chaos: Karen. She was standing across the street, clutching the gun in her trembling hands, staring at the scene unfolding before her with wide, almost panicked eyes. Karen didn't move. She didn't try to help or approach the family. Instead, she stood frozen, her mind racing as the reality of what she had done started to sink in. But even in the face of such a catastrophic mistake, Karen couldn't seem to fully grasp the gravity of the situation. Her mind was already constructing an excuse, a justification for the actions she had taken. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to, Karen muttered over and over, her voice shaky and strained. She began to walk toward the family, but no one moved to stop her. Her eyes darted from one bystander to the next, panic mounting as she realized people were staring at her with wide eyes, accusing her without saying a word. I didn't mean it. Karen repeated, her voice growing louder. It was the noise. The crowd. It was too much. I thought someone was attacking me. I thought, her words faltered as her eyes locked on Sarah's blood-stained clothes. I thought the wheelchair was an obstacle. I was just trying to protect myself. Maria's breath hitched in her throat as she heard Karen's words. She had expected an apology, or at the very least, some acknowledgement of the horror that had just occurred. Instead, Karen stood there, attempting to justify her actions, as if the noise and confusion of the parade were enough to absolve her of shooting a young woman in cold blood. You thought, what? Maria shouted, her voice breaking through the fog of shock. She was trembling, a mixture of disbelief and rage bubbling to the surface. You thought my daughter was a threat? A danger to you? This is on you, Karen. You shot her. You hurt my daughter. Karen seemed to recoil at the anger in Maria's voice, but she quickly regained her composure, her expression tightening into something almost defensive. I didn't mean it. I thought the wheelchair was in my way, and when I heard all that noise, I just panicked. I couldn't think straight. The crowd, the shouting, it was too much. I thought someone was going to hurt me. Her words spilled out, each one more desperate than the last. She was painting herself as the victim, as someone who had been driven to the brink by the noise and the chaos. And yet, in doing so, she completely disregarded the fact that her actions had caused irreparable harm. The noise made you do it? Maria's voice trembled with disbelief. Are you really blaming the noise for what you've done? Are you blaming us for what you've done to our family? Karen's eyes welled with tears, and she took a shaky step toward Sarah, as if trying to somehow bridge the distance between them. I didn't mean it. I thought I was protecting myself. The crowd was so loud, and I thought I was in danger. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. But Maria, filled with fury, stepped in front of Sarah, her body a protective barrier. You don't get to justify this. You don't get to hide behind your fear and make us the ones who should be sorry. You shot my daughter. You hurt her. And now you're trying to act like the victim? Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. The crowd around them was growing, murmurs of disbelief and confusion spreading through the bystanders. Some were beginning to move toward Karen, others were glancing nervously at the family, unsure of what to make of the situation. But for Sarah's family, there was no confusion. There was no mistaking what had happened. As the paramedics arrived, Sarah was carefully loaded into the ambulance, her breathing shallow but steady. Maria's hands were shaking as she kissed her daughter's forehead. The pain of seeing Sarah so vulnerable, so close to death, tore through Maria's chest. She wasn't sure if Sarah would make it through this, but she was sure of one thing: Karen needed to be held accountable. Your fear didn't cause this, Karen, Maria spat, her voice raw. Your actions did. And you will answer for what you've done. Karen looked down at the gun in her hand, her face pale and twisted with guilt and confusion. She muttered a quick apology, but the words seemed empty in the face of what had just occurred. Maria didn't wait for her to say more. She turned and followed the paramedics to the ambulance, her heart breaking for Sarah, for everything they had just lost, and for the long road ahead. As the ambulance doors slammed shut, the crowd around them began to disperse, and the media started to arrive, cameras flashing and microphones being shoved into the faces of witnesses. The incident was already spiraling into a public spectacle, and Karen, standing alone on the sidewalk, could feel the weight of the eyes on her. Some people were beginning to whisper in her direction, while others cast judgment from afar. Her story, the one she had told herself to justify her actions, was beginning to unravel. As the police arrived to take statements and collect evidence, Karen found herself surrounded by a mixture of reporters, police officers, and concerned citizens, all waiting for her explanation. But there was no excuse that could cover what had happened. She could no longer hide behind her version of the truth. What had been a tragic accident, in her eyes, had become a moment of undeniable guilt. The media quickly began to spread Karen's side of the story, some sympathizing with her fear and panic, while others began to question her motives. The narrative she had created, one of a frightened woman acting in self-defense, started to gain traction in the community, but the damage was already done. The family was broken, and Karen's attempt to shift the blame would never fully erase the horror she had caused. For Maria, there was only one thing that mattered now: making sure that Sarah got the justice she deserved. The world might listen to Karen's excuses, but Maria would make sure the truth came out. The fight was far from over. The chaos of the parade was still fresh in everyone's minds as the days following the shooting passed in a blur of grief, confusion, and anger. The police had arrived on the scene immediately after the shot was fired, securing the area and starting the difficult process of gathering evidence. They had questioned Karen, who insisted she had acted in self-defense, blaming the loud noise of the crowd for her fear and panic. Her story was quickly spreading, with some people buying into the narrative of a frightened woman who had simply snapped. But for Maria, the pieces of the puzzle weren't adding up. The gunshot, the fear in Karen's voice, it all felt too rehearsed, too convenient. It wasn't just about the noise. Maria's instincts told her there was more to the story, something Karen was hiding beneath her trembling excuses. Sarah's condition had stabilized, but it was clear that the road to recovery would be long and uncertain. The bullet had grazed her side, but the shock of the injury, coupled with the trauma of the whole event, had left her exhausted. She was in and out of consciousness, drifting between moments of clarity and confusion. Maria spent every moment at her daughter's side, holding her hand and watching the monitors as they beeped steadily. Each day, she prayed for a sign that Sarah would be okay, that she would heal, that she would wake up and be able to move forward from this nightmare. But as Sarah slept, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper lurking beneath the surface, something that Karen wasn't saying. Determined to find out the truth, Maria started digging into Karen's past. She needed to understand who this woman was, what could drive her to such drastic, violent actions. The idea that Karen had simply acted out of fear seemed too convenient. Maria began to ask around the neighborhood, speaking with people who had known Karen longer than she had. It didn't take long for unsettling details to emerge. Karen had lived in the neighborhood for years, and while she had always been an active member of the homeowners association, she wasn't well liked. There were rumors about her overbearing nature, her strict enforcement of neighborhood rules, and her deep dissatisfaction with anything she considered imperfect. She had a reputation for criticizing neighbors over trivial matters: the color of their front doors, the height of their grass, the way their garbage bins were arranged. But there was more to it than that. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Parker, had known Karen for years and had a chilling story to tell. Karen's always had this thing about perfection. It's like she can't stand anything that doesn't fit her ideal. I remember when her husband was alive, he was always so quiet, always keeping to himself. But Karen, she'd go on and on about how everything had to be perfect. If it wasn't, she'd have a fit. I remember her telling me once that imperfection was a disease that could infect a whole community. Maria listened intently, her stomach churning as she realized just how deeply Karen's obsession with control and order ran. It wasn't just about the noise at the parade, or Sarah's presence in the wheelchair, it was about Karen's irrational hatred of anything that didn't fit her ideal of how things should be. And Sarah, with her disability, was the perfect target. Maria continued her search, uncovering more details that painted a disturbing picture of Karen's mindset. Another neighbor, James, had witnessed Karen's behavior firsthand. She used to complain about the oddest things. One time, she told me that she didn't like how I parked my car. She said it was an eyesore. I didn't even think it was that big of a deal, but to her, it was like the end of the world. She told me I was ruining the neighborhood's reputation. And if I didn't fix it, she'd have to take it to the HOA. That's how she worked. Everything had to be the way she wanted it, or there would be consequences. Maria's stomach tightened as she pieced everything together. Karen's need for control, her obsessive focus on perfection, her fear of anything that didn't conform to her rigid standards, it all made sense. Karen had viewed Sarah as a disruption, something that didn't belong in her vision of the perfect neighborhood. Sarah's disability, her wheelchair, had become the symbol of everything Karen despised. The thought that someone like Karen could view her daughter as an imperfection, something that needed to be removed, sent a cold shiver down Maria's spine. But the most chilling detail of all came from a conversation Maria had with the local pharmacist. Karen? She came in a few weeks ago, asking if we had any medication that could help with anxiety or panic attacks. She seemed agitated, but nothing out of the ordinary. I just thought maybe she was stressed from all the HOA stuff. But she asked about something to calm her nerves, just like that. It wasn't a prescription, she wanted over-the-counter stuff. Maria's breath caught in her throat as she connected the dots. The panic Karen had described when she shot Sarah, was it genuine fear, or was it something more calculated? Maria couldn't help but wonder if Karen's so-called panic attack was just an excuse, a cover for something darker brewing beneath the surface. Could it be that the shooting hadn't been a result of noise-induced fear but rather a premeditated act, an attack born of her growing animosity toward Sarah? Maria's mind raced as she pieced together everything she had learned about Karen's past. She was no longer convinced that Karen's actions had been an accident, triggered by panic. What if Karen had been harboring a deep resentment toward Sarah for years, a resentment rooted in her need for control and perfection? What if the shooting had been the culmination of that resentment, a moment when Karen felt that Sarah's presence, and her disability, had to be eradicated from her ideal world? Maria's determination to find the truth grew even stronger. She couldn't allow Karen to get away with this, to hide behind a convenient excuse. The shooting wasn't just an accident, it was a manifestation of Karen's long-standing disdain for anything that didn't conform to her perfect world. And Maria knew she had to expose the truth for the sake of her daughter and the justice they both deserved. The investigation was far from over, and the more Maria uncovered, the more she was certain that Karen's actions were not just the result of fear, they were the result of something much darker. Something she would have to fight to bring into the light. The aftermath of the shooting reverberated through the entire community, like the shockwaves after a bomb dropped into still water. What had started as an annual celebration of veterans, a day of pride and patriotism, quickly became a flashpoint of division and outrage. The parade, meant to honor heroes, had ended in violence, and the consequences of that violence rippled far beyond Sarah's family. Almost immediately, the neighborhood was divided. The question on everyone's lips wasn't just about Sarah's recovery, it was about Karen's actions, her motives, and whether she should be held accountable. Some rallied behind her, arguing that the noise from the parade had triggered her panic, and that the incident was an unfortunate accident. In their eyes, Karen was just a victim of her circumstances, a woman overwhelmed by the chaos of the event, pushed to a breaking point by the intensity of the crowd. I know Karen. She's not violent. She's just always been a bit uptight, I guess, said one of the neighbors, a woman named Carol who had lived on the block for years. I'm sure it was a misunderstanding. The crowd noise, the excitement of the parade, it was all too much for her. We can't just jump to conclusions. It was an accident. No one could have predicted that. But not everyone agreed. As word of the shooting spread, others in the neighborhood were outraged. For them, Karen's actions were inexcusable. A woman with a weapon, firing indiscriminately in a crowd, had no right to hide behind panic as an excuse. Sarah had been sitting quietly, part of the crowd, just like everyone else. She wasn't a threat, she wasn't even standing. How could Karen justify what she had done? "Karen's always been trouble," said another neighbor, Ben, who had lived next door to the HOA president for over a decade. "She's been a nuisance to everyone here. Complaining about everything, how people park, how they mow their lawns. I never thought she'd take it this far, but I guess we should have known. She's always had this way of thinking she could control everything. And now look at what she's done." As the community began to split, so did the support. Those who sided with Karen were adamant that she had acted out of fear, and while they acknowledged that it was tragic, they didn't see it as something deserving of punishment. They believed the situation was a result of heightened emotions, a misunderstanding that got out of hand. On the other side, people like Ben were horrified by Karen's actions, calling it a calculated act of violence, unjustifiable, no matter how loud the parade had been. But amid all this division, the veterans themselves became an unexpected focal point. The parade had been their day to shine, a time to reflect on the sacrifices they had made for their country. Now, their event had been tainted by the violence that had occurred. Veterans who had proudly marched down the street found themselves caught in the middle of the controversy, many of them feeling deeply uncomfortable with the way the situation was evolving. "I don't know what to make of it," said one veteran, James, who had marched in the parade that day. "It should have been a day to celebrate us, but now we're part of this mess. I'm heartbroken for Sarah, but I also feel for Karen. She didn't ask for this either. The whole thing is just tragic." Some veterans spoke out, condemning the violence and calling for justice for Sarah, while others seemed more focused on the idea of giving Karen the benefit of the doubt, seeing her as someone who had suffered from stress and fear rather than someone guilty of reckless behavior. The parade, which had once brought the community together, now symbolized everything that was wrong with the fractured state of their neighborhood. While the neighborhood continued to splinter, Sarah's condition slowly began to improve. Maria spent every waking moment at her daughter's side, watching the machines beep and hum around her, praying for her recovery. Sarah had been in critical condition when she arrived at the hospital, the bullet having grazed her side. The injury was not life-threatening, but it had caused significant trauma. Her body, already fragile from the effects of cerebral palsy, was struggling to bounce back. Each day felt like an eternity. Maria barely slept, her thoughts consumed by what had happened to her daughter, the community's reaction, and the growing sense of injustice she felt. It was impossible to focus on anything else. Every time Sarah stirred, every time her heart rate seemed to slow, Maria was there, watching over her, waiting for the moment when her daughter would wake up and reassure her that everything would be okay. But despite the pain, despite the exhaustion, Maria remained determined. She knew that seeking justice for Sarah was the only way forward. The family had been through too much to let it go now. And yet, as much as Maria wanted to see Karen face the consequences of her actions, there was a part of her that struggled with the idea of hatred. Sarah, in her quiet wisdom, had told Maria time and time again that holding on to anger only weighed them down. "Mom, we have to move forward," Sarah had said, her voice weak but clear when she had finally regained consciousness. "We can't let her control us. We have to forgive. I know it's hard, but we can't live like this." Her words echoed in Maria's mind as she sat beside Sarah, watching her daughter drift in and out of sleep. The fight for justice was important, but Maria knew that Sarah had a point. It wasn't just about Karen. It was about the family healing, about them finding peace after the chaos. The question was whether she could reconcile that need for justice with the desire to move on from the pain, the anger, the hurt. Sarah was still fragile, physically and emotionally, but Maria could feel her daughter's strength in every word she spoke. As much as Maria wanted to protect her, as much as she wanted to shield her from the cruelty of the world, she knew Sarah had already shown her the way. Healing would come, not just from the justice they sought, but from the ability to forgive, to let go, and to reclaim the peace they had once had. The community's reaction would continue to unfold, but for now, Maria's focus was clear. She had to support her daughter, help her heal, and figure out how to move forward, whether the neighborhood stood behind them or not. The journey was far from over, but Maria had never been more certain of what her next step had to be. The days were starting to stretch into weeks as Sarah slowly recovered from the traumatic shooting. Every day, her condition improved a little more, but the emotional toll of what had happened still weighed heavily on her. The noise, the chaos, and the pain from that moment haunted her thoughts, and the neighborhood had not been kind in their reactions. The division between those who supported Sarah's family and those who sided with Karen continued to grow, but Maria knew that none of it would bring closure to the situation. The only way forward, she realized, was to confront Karen directly. Karen had been avoiding them ever since the shooting, disappearing from the neighborhood as if hoping that time would erase her actions. But Maria knew that she couldn't allow that to happen. She couldn't let Karen hide from the consequences of what she had done to her daughter. After everything, after watching Sarah fight for her life, Maria could not stand by and let Karen walk away without taking responsibility. One chilly morning, after another restless night spent watching over Sarah, Maria made the decision. She had to confront Karen, she needed answers, and she needed justice. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about making sure that Karen's actions didn't go unpunished, that Sarah's suffering wasn't in vain. Karen's house was quiet, as it usually was. It stood at the end of the street, perfectly maintained and pristine, much like Karen herself. Maria walked up to the door, her fists clenched at her sides, her heart pounding in her chest. She could already feel the knot of anger forming in her stomach, but it wasn't just anger anymore. It was something deeper, a sense of grief, of betrayal, of disbelief that Karen had not once reached out to apologize or even acknowledge the damage she had caused. Maria knocked, her heart racing in anticipation. The door opened slowly, and there stood Karen, her face pale, her eyes tired but calculating. She had been expecting this moment, Maria could tell. But she stood in the doorway nonetheless, arms crossed defensively, as if she were bracing herself for what was to come. "What do you want, Maria?" Karen's voice was low, almost bored, as though this conversation was something she could dismiss easily. But Maria wasn't here to let her off the hook. "You know exactly why I'm here," Maria said, her voice steady, though her fists were trembling with emotion. "You shot my daughter. You almost killed her, Karen. And now you're acting like it never happened. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Karen's eyes flickered with something, regret, guilt? It was hard to tell. She stepped back slightly, as if opening the door wider might give her more space to breathe. "It wasn't like that," she said, her voice trembling slightly, though she quickly masked it with defensiveness. "I wasn't trying to hurt her. I was just overwhelmed. The noise, the crowd, it made me panic. I thought I was in danger." Maria's blood boiled at Karen's words. She could see it now, Karen still refused to take responsibility, still blamed the situation rather than her own reckless actions. "You thought my daughter, sitting in her wheelchair, was a threat? A threat to you? You're seriously standing there, trying to justify what you did?" Karen took a deep breath, avoiding Maria's gaze. "It wasn't supposed to happen. I was scared. The noise from the crowd was too much. It felt like an attack, and I didn't know what else to do." "You didn't know what else to do?" Maria's voice cracked with emotion. "You had a gun, Karen. You aimed it at my daughter. How do you justify that? How do you justify pulling the trigger?" Karen's face hardened, and for a moment, Maria saw the mask of control slip. But it was brief. Karen quickly recovered, her stance defensive. "I didn't want it to go that far. But the noise, it was like I couldn't think. I had to do something to protect myself." "Protect yourself?" Maria repeated, the disbelief in her voice palpable. From a disabled young woman who was just trying to enjoy a parade like anyone else? You've got to be kidding me. Karen's face reddened, her fingers twitching slightly as she stood still, almost like she was waiting for the conversation to end. She seemed almost relieved when Maria fell silent, her eyes flicking away to look at the empty street behind her. She cleared her throat, finally speaking in a quieter, almost apologetic tone. I'm sorry, okay? Karen's words hung in the air, but they felt hollow. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I wasn't thinking straight. I thought it was just all too much, and I acted out of fear. But I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, I swear. Maria felt a surge of anger rush through her, but it wasn't just anger anymore, it was pure, unfiltered grief. She had watched Sarah struggle, she had sat by her daughter's bedside for days, praying for her to recover. And Karen, who had been the one to pull the trigger, was standing here, still trying to hide behind her excuses, her fragile justifications. I don't believe you, Maria said, her voice low and steady. I don't believe that you acted out of fear. You made a choice. You pulled that trigger. And now, my daughter is paying the price. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but the words faltered in her throat. She had nothing left to say. The truth had already come out, and she knew it. Maria wasn't going to buy the story she was trying to sell. Maria took a deep breath, her chest tight with the weight of everything that had happened. She had confronted Karen, demanding an explanation, and though Karen's defenses were weak, she had still refused to take full responsibility. That much was clear. Maria's heart broke for Sarah, for the pain her daughter had endured, and for the world they lived in, a world where people like Karen could act without consequence. Maria's voice grew firmer, her decision clear. This isn't over, Karen. I will make sure you face the consequences for what you've done. This is not something that will go unpunished. Karen recoiled slightly at Maria's words, her eyes widening in fear, but Maria wasn't finished. I've tried to reason with you, to give you a chance to make this right, but you refuse. So now, I'll make sure the world knows what you did. The system will take care of it. But know this, you won't escape the truth. With those final words, Maria turned and walked away, her heart heavy with the realization that the road ahead would be long, but it was the only road she could walk. She wasn't just fighting for Sarah anymore, she was fighting for the truth. And no amount of excuses from Karen would ever stop her from making sure that justice was served. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. News outlets filled the benches, eager to cover what had quickly become the town's most infamous case. The shooting of Sarah during the Veterans Parade had shaken the community to its core, and now the question of justice hung in the air, thick with anticipation. Maria sat at the front, her eyes fixed on the proceedings, her thoughts a whirlwind. Sarah, still recovering physically and emotionally, had chosen to stay at home, too overwhelmed by the media attention. Maria knew this battle was hers to fight, but Sarah would stand beside her in spirit. They had been through so much, and they both knew that facing Karen in court was the final step in reclaiming their lives. Karen's defense attorney had already started painting the picture of a woman pushed to her limits, driven to act out of fear. My client has suffered from severe anxiety and panic disorders for years, the lawyer argued, his voice calm, attempting to win the jury's sympathy. On the day of the parade, with the loud noises, the overwhelming crowd, she feared for her safety. In her panic, she made a tragic and impulsive decision. Maria's fists clenched in her lap as she listened. She knew what Karen's defense would be, it had been her excuse from the beginning. She had heard it all before. The question was whether the jury would buy it, whether they would see Karen as a frightened woman who made a terrible mistake, or as a person who had let her anger and control issues spiral into violence. But Maria and her lawyer had a different narrative to tell. They had testimonies from the community, from neighbors who had seen Karen's pattern of controlling behavior, who had witnessed her hostility toward anyone who didn't fit into her narrow vision of what the neighborhood should be. They had Sarah's statement, a powerful and moving account of the pain she had suffered, not just physically, but emotionally. The community had seen Sarah as a young woman trying to live her life, not as someone to be feared, and that was what Maria and her lawyer hoped would resonate with the jury. The trial dragged on for weeks, the courtroom filled with heated debates and emotional testimony. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. Maria would come home every night drained, feeling as though the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. But she knew this fight was necessary. It wasn't just about Sarah's recovery, it was about sending a message to the community. The actions of one person, driven by fear, prejudice, and anger, should not go unpunished. They had to stand firm, not only for Sarah, but for the integrity of their community. Finally, the verdict came. After days of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The room held its collective breath as the judge read aloud the decision. Karen Thompson, the judge began, his voice heavy, "You have been found guilty of reckless endangerment and aggravated assault." Maria's heart pounded in her chest. The words she had hoped to hear had finally been spoken, but they were quickly followed by a sentence that would leave her feeling hollow. However, the judge continued, "Given the circumstances of the case, the court will impose a reduced sentence of probation, counseling, and 100 hours of community service. You will not face jail time." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Maria's stomach dropped as she absorbed the news. The community had rallied behind the idea of justice, and yet here they were, left with a verdict that felt like a slap in the face. Karen, the woman who had shot Sarah, who had caused so much pain, was not going to face the consequences of her actions in the way that Maria had hoped. Instead, she was being given a second chance, a chance to walk free and continue her life with little more than a slap on the wrist. As the courtroom emptied and people whispered among themselves, Maria stood frozen, her thoughts racing. She had wanted justice, not just for Sarah, but for everyone who had suffered because of Karen's actions. She had wanted her to pay for what she had done, to face the consequences of her violence. But in the end, the system had failed them. Karen had avoided the harshest penalty, and Maria's frustration boiled over. The system had failed Sarah, and it had failed them all. But then Maria thought of Sarah, resting at home, recovering from the ordeal. She thought of her daughter's strength, the way she had overcome every obstacle that had been thrown her way. Sarah hadn't allowed the shooting to define her. She hadn't allowed Karen's actions to rob her of her spirit. Maria realized then that justice wasn't about the verdict. It wasn't about what Karen would or wouldn't have to endure. Justice was in how Sarah and Maria chose to move forward. Justice was in their resilience, their ability to rise above the hurt, and to find healing in spite of the system's shortcomings. At home, Maria shared the verdict with Sarah, her voice shaking as she relayed the news. Sarah listened quietly, her face unreadable. When Maria was done, there was silence between them. Then, Sarah spoke, her voice steady. "It's not fair, Mom. But we knew it wouldn't be. The system isn't perfect." Maria nodded, fighting back tears. "I'm so sorry, Sarah." You thought we'd get justice," Sarah interrupted softly. "But sometimes, it's not about the court. It's about what we do next." And that was when Maria realized her daughter was right. The battle wasn't over, it was only just beginning. The community had witnessed the trial, and they knew the truth of what had happened. Karen's actions, though legally pardoned, would never be forgotten. And as the world moved on, Sarah would continue to speak out about her experience, using her voice to inspire others who had faced similar hardships. In the weeks that followed, Sarah did just that. She spoke at local community events, sharing her story with others who had suffered in silence. Her bravery became a beacon of hope for those who had been overlooked or mistreated, a reminder that healing was possible, even when justice wasn't served in the way they had hoped. Maria stood by her side, proud of the woman her daughter had become. As the community slowly began to heal, Maria and Sarah moved forward, stronger than ever. They knew that Karen's actions would never fully define them, but they also knew that they had taken back control of their narrative. They had faced the worst, and they had come out on top, not because of a court decision, but because of their strength, their unity, and their ability to rise above the pain.